Know your place." Earl Ashford said it softly enough that no servant in the corridor could claim he had shouted, but loudly enough that every silver fork in the dining room seemed to stop moving. 40 nobles sat beneath the candlelight of Ashford House, their faces turned toward the young maid standing beside the long mahogany table with a wine jug trembling in her hand. Beatrice Hollins was 26 years old, dressed in plain black wool with a white apron tied so tightly around her waist she could feel every breath against it. She had been in that house for most of her life. She knew which guests preferred port, which countess hid her debts behind diamonds, which gentleman smiled at the Earl in public and cursed him in letters when he thought the servants could not read. But none of that mattered in that moment. To the people seated at the table, she was only a maid who had forgotten the correct direction of her eyes. The trouble had begun with a crest. Lady Marwick, seated 3 chairs from the Earl, had been admiring the Ashford family motto carved above the fireplace. She had misread the Latin inscription and laughed about how ancient families often kept old words no one understood. Without thinking, Beatrice had quietly corrected the translation while refilling the glass beside her. It was barely a whisper, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire, but Earl Ashford heard it. He turned his head slowly, as if the chair itself had been insulted. "Did the maid just instruct my guest?" he asked. A few people smiled, expecting a small joke. Beatrice lowered her eyes. "Forgive me, my lord." But forgiveness was not what he wanted. Humiliation was easier to serve than mercy, and that night Earl Ashford had a full table ready to consume it. He leaned back, one hand resting near his wine glass, and looked her over as though she were a stain on the carpet. "Tell me, Miss Hollins, do servants now study Latin between polishing boots and scraping plates?" A ripple of laughter moved down the table. Beatrice felt heat rise under her collar, but she kept her face still. That stillness angered him more than fear would have. "Perhaps tomorrow," he continued, "you will advise me on estate law, or perhaps you will correct my solicitor on inheritance." More laughter came then, louder, richer, crueler because it had permission. Beatrice's fingers tightened around the jug. She knew the words estate law. She knew inheritance. She knew them better than he imagined. For 8 years, in the hours when the house slept and the servants' candles burned low, she had read the books in the Ashford library by stolen light. She had traced names through ledgers, compared signatures, memorized dates, and taught herself the language of men who believed paper existed only to protect men like them. But she said nothing. Earl Ashford smiled as if he had won a game she had never agreed to play. Then he gave the sentence that would follow her for an entire year. "Know your place." The room laughed, not everyone loudly. Some only hid smiles behind napkins. Some looked away because looking away cost nothing. Beatrice stood in the center of their amusement, holding wine for people who owned more land than they had kindness. At the far end of the room, above the dark fireplace, the Ashford crest watched from old stone. Beyond the dining room doors lay the library, with its locked cabinet, its dust-heavy shelves, its family records, and one reference in a ledger that had troubled her for weeks, a private settlement, a missing page, and 3 words written in fading ink beside a red mark: Hollins' claim unresolved. Beatrice lowered the wine jug. "Yes, my lord," she said. Her voice did not shake. That seemed to disappoint him. 1 year later, in that same room, under those same painted ancestors, Earl Ashford would not be laughing. The same nobles would sit with their hands folded and their eyes lowered. The servants would stand at the walls, barely breathing. A solicitor would break the red wax on a document older than Beatrice's grief, and the Earl would learn that the woman he had ordered to know her place had found it written in law, sealed in bloodline, and locked inside the history of his own house. Beatrice Hollins had first entered Ashford House as a child too young to understand why no one spoke her mother's name above a whisper. She remembered rain on the day she arrived, rain so hard it turned the carriage road into black mud and made the great house look as though it had risen from the earth rather than been built upon it. She had been 7 then, thin as a candle, with a small bundle of clothing and a feverish memory of her mother's hand slipping from hers. The housekeeper at the time, Mrs. Finch, had taken her in through the servants' entrance and given her broth, dry stockings, and a corner cot near the laundry room. No one explained much. Poor child, they said. Orphaned girl. Hollins blood, but no Hollins family left to claim her. That was the shape of her life before she knew enough to question it. She learned to fold linen before she learned long division. She learned which bells belonged to which rooms, which footmen drank, which maids cried, and which doors were never to be opened unless a gentleman had already walked through them. Ashford House was not merely a home. It was an order of the world, built in stone, polished by servants, and guarded by silence. The Earl stood at the top of that order. Men like him did not enter rooms. Rooms prepared themselves around his arrival. His boots struck marble as if the floor owed him sound. His gloves appeared before his hands asked for them. His tea arrived before thirst could inconvenience him. And beneath all of it moved people like Beatrice, invisible until something went wrong. If a glass broke, servants existed. If a guest was offended, servants existed. If a silver spoon was misplaced, servants existed very loudly indeed. But if a servant suffered, the house became death. Beatrice learned this young. She learned it when a kitchen girl burned her arm and was told not to drip tears into the sauce. She learned it when a footman was dismissed for coughing too harshly near a duchess. She learned it when Earl Ashford passed through the servants' hall one winter morning and said, without looking at any of them, "A good house is like a good machine. Every small part should move without being noticed." That was his idea of mercy. To be unseen if you served him well. Beatrice might have become exactly what he expected, if not for the library. The Ashford Library was the only room in the house that seemed to breathe after midnight. By day it belonged to gentlemen with brandy, arguments, and careless hands. By night, when the fire had died and the doors were supposed to remain shut, it belonged to dust, moonlight, and Beatrice. She discovered it by accident at 16, sent to retrieve a shawl left by Lady Ashford before the Countess died. The room had frightened her at first. Books rose higher than church windows. Ladders leaned against shelves like invitations no servant was meant to accept. Leather spines carried gold titles in languages she had never been taught. She should have taken the shawl and left. Instead, she touched one book with the back of her finger, as though touching it directly might be theft. It was a book of old legal cases, dry and difficult, filled with sentences so long they seemed designed to keep the poor outside them. She understood almost nothing that first night, but she understood enough to know that language was a locked door, and locks could be studied. From then on, she read whenever the house slept. She began with dictionaries, then letters, then histories of noble families. She copied unfamiliar words onto scraps hidden inside her mattress. Entail, settlement, probate, executor, Remainder. Devise. Her hands smelled of soap, ash, and ink. By day, she scrubbed floors beneath portraits of dead Ashfords. By night, she read how dead men continued ruling the living through documents. Years passed. The girl with the bundle became a woman with quiet eyes and a memory no one suspected. She learned the rhythm of the estate accounts, the names of tenants, the shape of old leases, the difference between a property owned outright and one held under settlement. At first, it was only hunger. Books gave her a self no one could order about. Then it became suspicion. The Ashford records were too neat in some places and too damaged in others. Certain years had been copied twice. Certain payments were marked only by initials. The Hollins name, which she had been told belonged to nobody important, appeared in margins where it should not have appeared at all. Once, in a brittle index volume, she found an entry that read, "Hollins, Eleanor. See Private Family Settlement." Eleanor had been her mother's name. Beatrice stared at that line for so long, the candle burned low enough to blister her fingers with wax. The next page had been cut out, not torn in haste, not damaged by age, but sliced cleanly with a blade. After that night, the library no longer felt like refuge. It felt like a mouth holding back a secret. She searched carefully, never taking enough to be noticed, never leaving dust disturbed where dust was expected. She found an estate ledger from 21 years earlier that listed a payment to a London solicitor beside the phrase, "Red Seal Retained." She found a family correspondence book with 3 missing letters between the late Earl and a woman identified only as E.H. She found a map of the 280-acre Ashford Estate, marked with an older boundary line and a notation in a hand she did not recognize. Transfer conditional upon female issue. She did not fully understand it, and that frightened her more than ignorance. Something had happened before she was born. Something involving her mother. Something involving land. Something someone had decided a servant girl should never know. Mrs. Finch noticed before anyone else did. The old housekeeper had eyes sharpened by 40 years of surviving rich people. One dawn, as Beatrice returned a legal volume to its shelf, she turned and found Mrs. Finch standing in the doorway with a candle. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Then Mrs. Finch looked at the book, looked at Beatrice, and said, "You had better learn faster than they expect." Beatrice waited for punishment. It did not come. Instead, Mrs. Finch crossed the room, took the book from her hands, and placed it one shelf higher where no casual eye would see the gap. "There are names in this house," the old woman said, "that were not forgotten. They were buried." Beatrice whispered, "My mother's name?" Mrs. Finch's face tightened, but she gave no answer. That was answer enough. From that morning onward, Beatrice lived in 2 houses at once. In one, she was a maid who rose before sunrise, fastened her apron, polished the banisters, and lowered her gaze when nobles passed. In the other, she was an investigator, moving through shadows, gathering fragments of a story written by people who had assumed she would never learn to read it. Earl Ashford never noticed. To him, her silence meant emptiness, her obedience meant surrender, her plain dress meant plain thought. He saw the lowered head, never the listening mind beneath it. That was why, on the night of the dinner, his insult landed before 40 nobles like a final stamp on what he believed she was. Know your place. Beatrice carried those words out of the dining room and into the servants' corridor. Behind her, laughter rose again, muffled by the closing doors. In the narrow passage, the air smelled of coal smoke, boiled carrots, damp wool, and humiliation swallowed too many times by too many people. One young maid touched her sleeve and whispered, "Do not think on it, Bee. Gentlemen say things." Beatrice looked at the girl's hand, then at the wall where the servant bells hung in a row, each one labeled with a room that could command them at any hour. "Yes," she said, "they do." Mrs. Finch stood near the stairwell, her face pale in the lamplight. For once, she did not tell Beatrice to return to work. She only said quietly, "Some places are assigned. Some are stolen." Beatrice did not answer. She turned toward the back stairs, climbed past the linen closet, past the cold landing, past the corridor where portraits of Ashford men stared down with inherited certainty. At the library door she stopped. Her hands were still shaking, but not from shame now. Shame had burned away into something cleaner. She entered without lighting the main lamp. Moonlight crossed the carpet in long silver bars. The books waited. The locked cabinet stood against the far wall, its brass handle dull with age. Beatrice went first to the index volume, Hollins, Eleanor. See Private Family Settlement. The cut page still followed it like a wound. Then she opened the estate ledger and found again the entry she had copied 3 weeks earlier. Red seal retained. Private custody. Ashford Hollins matter unresolved. This time, beneath the line, she noticed something she had missed before. Not a sentence, not even a full name, but a solicitor's mark stamped faintly in blue ink at the edge of the page. Vale and Mercer, Chancery Lane, London. Her breath caught. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a door. And for the first time in her life, Beatrice Hollins understood that knowing her place might not mean staying where Earl Ashford had put her. It might mean finding the place he had stolen, following the paper trail out of Ashford House, and returning one day with a document no laughter could silence. For 3 nights after the dinner, Beatrice Hollins did not sleep longer than an hour at a time. By day she moved through Ashford House with the same lowered eyes, the same quiet steps, the same hands folded before her when she passed a guest or family member in the hall. No one watching her would have known that the words Earl Ashford had thrown across the dining room had not crushed her. They had sharpened her. Know your place. The phrase followed her into the scullery, into the linen room, into the servants' attic where frost gathered along the inside of the window panes before dawn. It returned each time she heard the dining room bell ring. It returned when she polished the silver fork Lady Marwick had used while laughing at her. It returned when one of the footmen repeated the Earl's line in a cruel whisper, and 2 kitchen girls giggled because cruelty was safer when borrowed from a master. Beatrice said nothing to any of them. Silence had protected her for years, and now she needed it more than ever. On the 4th night, when the house had settled into the deep stillness that came after wine, gossip, and overfed pride, she took the stub of a candle from beneath her mattress, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and went back to the library. She did not walk like a thief. Thieves hurried. Thieves disturbed dust, knocked chair legs, breathed too loudly at doors. Beatrice walked like a servant who knew every board in the house and exactly which ones complained. She reached the library just as the clock in the west corridor struck 2. The room was cold enough that her breath clouded faintly before her, but she did not light the fire. Fire invited notice. Candlelight, hidden behind her palm, was enough. She went first to the estate ledger, then to the brittle index, then to the cabinet against the far wall. It had always seemed less important than the books because it was smaller, darker, and almost plain. But that plainness now felt deliberate. A brass lock held the doors shut. Above it, carved into the wood, was the Ashford crest, a stag beneath a crown, its head lifted as if listening to something beneath the earth. Beatrice knelt and studied the lock. She had seen keys carried through the house all her life: the pantry key, the wine cellar key, the silver room key. The library cabinet key was different. Earl Ashford kept it not with the butler, not with the steward, but in the small ring attached to his own writing desk. That alone told her the cabinet did not merely contain old papers. Men like Ashford did not personally guard dust. She could not force it open. She had neither tools nor time. So she did what she had always done. She watched. The opportunity came 5 days later, because arrogance made people careless in ways poverty never allowed. Earl Ashford had spent the afternoon in the library with his steward, complaining over tenant arrears and the cost of repairing the north tenant cottages, which he considered a sentimental expense. Beatrice was sent in twice with tea, once with coal, and once to retrieve an inkstand from the writing desk. On the final visit, she saw the key ring lying beside a stack of correspondence. The Earl was turned toward the window, scolding the steward about a tenant widow who had requested another month to pay. "If one woman is permitted to weep her way out of rent," he said, "every cottage on the estate will discover tears." The steward murmured agreement. Beatrice placed the inkstand down and lowered her head. In that instant, she saw the cabinet key clearly. Narrow iron shaft, small round bow, a notch near the end shaped like a broken tooth. She did not touch it. She did not need to. By nightfall, she had drawn it from memory on the back of a laundry tally. 2 nights after that, she borrowed an old key from Mrs. Finch's ring, one that opened nothing important anymore, and spent an hour filing a notch into it with a broken kitchen blade until her fingers stung. It was a foolish attempt, and she knew it. A copied key made by a maid in a laundry room was not likely to open a nobleman's private cabinet. But the attempt itself steadied her. It gave her hands something to do while her mind chased fear in circles. On the 3rd night, Mrs. Finch found her sitting near the dying kitchen fire with iron filings on her apron. The old woman looked once at the key, once at Beatrice's face, and said, "If that lock opens, it will open more than wood." Beatrice expected warning. Instead, Mrs. Finch reached into the pocket beneath her black dress and placed a small brass key on the table. "I was not always housekeeper," she said. "Before the present Earl inherited, the old Countess trusted me with things she ought to have burned and could not bear to lose." Beatrice stared at the key. "Is it for the cabinet?" Mrs. Finch's mouth tightened. "It was, years ago." "Why give it to me now?" The old woman's eyes moved toward the ceiling, toward the floors above them, toward the rooms where the Ashfords slept beneath embroidered blankets while servants below counted coal. "Because your mother once asked me to remember where she hid her fear." Beatrice could not speak. Mrs. Finch pushed the key closer. "Do not ask me more tonight. Some truth must be read before it is said." The brass key opened the cabinet on the first turn. The sound was small, almost delicate, but to Beatrice it felt like thunder passing through her bones. She waited, frozen, listening for footsteps beyond the library door. None came. Slowly, she opened the cabinet. Inside were bundles of old letters tied with faded ribbon, estate maps rolled in cracked leather, a box of seals, 2 account books, and a narrow drawer lined in green cloth. Beatrice took nothing at first. She only looked. That was how she survived. First see, then touch, then remember, then decide. The top packet of letters bore the name Ashford in a masculine hand she recognized from old portraits and signed documents. The late Earl, father of the present one. Beneath it was another packet marked E.H. Her hands stopped. Eleanor Hollins. She untied the ribbon with care. The first letter was not addressed to a servant. It began, "My dear Eleanor," and contained a tenderness Beatrice had never seen associated with her mother's name. The late Earl had written of arrangements, of risk, of a promise made before witnesses, of a settlement that must remain sealed until the proper time. Another letter mentioned a child, not by name, but by phrase. If the girl lives, the line continues. Beatrice pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She had been told her mother had come to Ashford House as a poor relation of no consequence, then fallen ill and died in service. But these letters did not speak of a servant dismissed into charity. They spoke of a woman hidden because her existence complicated inheritance. In the narrow drawer, Beatrice found an estate map older than the one in the public records. The 280-acre boundary was marked not only with Ashford Holdings, but with a notation: conditional transfer under Hollins Ashford settlement. Beneath it, in the same hand as the ledger, were the words, "Red-sealed deed lodged in private custody, Chancery Lane, Vale and Mercer." There it was again. The blue stamp, the London name, the door beyond the door. Beatrice did not find the deed that night, but she found something almost as dangerous. Enough proof to know the deed existed. She copied what she could by candlelight, not in full sentences, but in anchors, dates, initials, solicitor name, map notation, settlement phrase, female issue, red seal, Chancery Lane. She hid the scraps inside the hem of an old petticoat. Then she returned every paper exactly as she had found it. At dawn, while she was folding table linen with raw eyes and ink beneath one fingernail, Earl Ashford walked into the servants' hall unannounced. Conversations died. He held a small strip of ribbon between 2 gloved fingers. Faded blue ribbon, the same kind that had tied the letters. Beatrice's stomach tightened, but her face did not move. "Someone," he said pleasantly, "has been touching family papers." No one answered. His gaze moved from servant to servant with lazy enjoyment. "I will not have rats in my library." He stopped before Beatrice. "Miss Hollins." She looked up. "My lord?" "You read, do you not?" The room seemed to shrink around her. "A little." "How unfortunate. A servant who reads is a servant who misunderstands her station." He smiled. "Have you misunderstood yours?" Beatrice knew then that he did not know what she had seen. Not yet. If he knew, he would not be smiling. He would be searching her mattress, her trunk, her hem. He suspected curiosity, not discovery. That difference was the width of her survival. "No, my lord," she said. "I have not misunderstood." He studied her for a moment. Then he lifted the ribbon. "If I find that any servant has opened my private cabinet, that servant will leave this house without character, without wages,
and without hope of respectable employment. Is that clear?" "Yes, my lord." He leaned closer,
lowering his voice so only she and perhaps Mrs. Finch could hear. "Some girls mistake silence for intelligence. Do not." Then he turned and left. By evening, Beatrice understood she could not remain in Ashford House much longer. The house had taught her everything it could without swallowing her. Now every corridor felt watched. Every bell sounded like accusation. Every servant who glanced her way seemed to know a fraction of something, though none could possibly know enough. Mrs. Finch said nothing in the laundry room, but when Beatrice shook out a sheet, a small cloth purse fell from inside the fold and landed at her feet. Inside were 3 coins, a folded address, and a sentence written in the housekeeper's careful hand. "Ask for Mr. Nathaniel Vale, formerly of Vale and Mercer, Chancery Lane. Bring dates, not tears." Beatrice closed her fingers around the purse so tightly the coins pressed circles into her skin. That night she packed no trunk. A trunk would announce departure. She took 1 dress, 1 comb, the copied scraps sewn into her hem, and the small pencil she had used in the library for years. Before dawn, she went one last time to the servants' corridor. The bells hung in their neat row, each room labeled in black letters: dining room, library, blue chamber, master's study. Each bell was a command disguised as an object. Beatrice looked longest at the library bell. Then she went to Mrs. Finch's small room near the back stairs. The old woman was awake, sitting upright as if she had been waiting since midnight. Neither of them embraced. In houses like Ashford, affection learned to disguise itself as instruction. "The morning carrier leaves at 6, Mrs. Finch said. "Do not take the main road past the south gate. The steward watches it." Beatrice nodded. "Did my mother know?" Mrs. Finch closed her eyes briefly. "She knew enough to be afraid." "Was she noble?" The old woman opened her eyes again. "She was wronged. Start there. Let the papers decide the rest." Beatrice swallowed. "Why did no one tell me?" "Because the truth was useful to powerful men only while it stayed buried." For a moment, the years between them filled the room. The dead mother, the hidden letters, the girl raised under the roof that may have stolen from her, the old servant who had kept a key because guilt sometimes outlived obedience. Mrs. Finch reached out and took Beatrice's hand. "When you reach London, do not beg. Men like solicitors expect poor women to beg. Give him the date from the map. Give him the phrase from the ledger. Give him your mother's name. Make him afraid of what you know." Beatrice nodded again because speech had become difficult. At the door, Mrs. Finch said, "Beatrice?" She turned. "Whatever they took, do not let revenge make you their mirror." Beatrice held the old woman's gaze. "I do not want to become them." "Good," Mrs. Finch said. "Then become what they fear." London did not welcome Beatrice Hollins. It received her the way it received most poor women, with noise, smoke, suspicion, and prices higher than mercy. The journey from Ashford Estate left mud on the hem of her dress and exhaustion deep in her bones. By the time she reached Chancery Lane, the city was already moving with clerks, messengers, barristers, errand boys, widows, debtors, and men in coats whose pockets carried other people's futures folded into documents. Buildings leaned over the street like old judges. Brass plaques shone beside dark doors. Names were written everywhere: firms, chambers, offices, men who knew the law well enough to sell pieces of it. Vale and Mercer no longer existed under that name. The plaque had been replaced. For one terrible hour, Beatrice thought the trail had ended before it began. Then a clerk, sweeping the front step of a nearby office, impatient with her questions but not entirely unkind, told her Mr. Nathaniel Vale had retired from the firm, but still kept a small consulting room 2 streets over. "Doesn't see many," the clerk said, "especially not girls without appointments." Beatrice thanked him and went anyway. Mr. Vale's office was on the 2nd floor above a stationer. It smelled of paper, dust, sealing wax, and old arguments. He was smaller than she expected, with white hair brushed carefully back and spectacles that made his eyes seem both sharp and tired. He looked at her dress before he looked at her face. "I do not require a maid," he said. Beatrice remained standing. "I am not seeking employment, sir." "Then you are seeking charity, and I am not useful for that either." She placed Mrs. Finch's folded address on his desk. "I am seeking the Ashford Hollins settlement." The change in him was so small that someone less trained in silence might have missed it. His fingers paused above a stack of papers. His eyes lifted. "Where did you hear that phrase?"
"In an estate ledger at Ashford House."
"Servants should not trouble themselves with ledgers." "So I have been told." He studied her more carefully then. "Your name?" "Beatrice Hollins." The room seemed to lose a degree of warmth. Mr. Vale removed his spectacles, cleaned them, though they were not dirty, and put them back on. "Hollins is not an uncommon name." "My mother was Eleanor Hollins. She lived at Ashford House. She died there. I was told she had no claim to anything." Mr. Vale did not answer. Beatrice took the copied scraps from the hidden seam of her dress and laid them on his desk one by one. "Private family settlement, female issue, red seal retained, Chancery Lane, conditional transfer, 280 acres. With each phrase, Mr. Vale's expression closed further, not in dismissal now, but in calculation. He picked up the scrap with the map date. His thumb moved over the penciled numbers. "Where did you get this?" "From the Ashford Library."
"Did Lord Ashford send you?" "Lord Ashford told me to know my place."
Mr. Vale looked at her for a long moment. "And where do you believe that is, Miss Hollins?" Beatrice's answer came quietly. "That is what I came to ask the papers."
Mr. Vale did not reveal everything that day. Men of law rarely surrender truth all at once. They release it in measured portions, as though too much honesty might damage the furniture. First, he questioned her. Dates, names, rooms, which ledger, which cabinet, which seal mark, which earl had signed the correspondence. Beatrice answered without embroidery. She did not weep. She did not plead. She gave him what Mrs. Finch had told her to give. Dates, not tears. At last, Mr. Vale rose, locked the office door, and pulled a narrow file from a cabinet behind his desk. The file was old, but not abandoned. That was the first thing Beatrice noticed. Abandoned papers gather neglect. These had been handled, hidden, and returned. "Your mother," he said carefully, "was not merely a servant." Beatrice felt the words enter her like cold water. "Then what was she?" "A woman inconvenient to the Ashford succession." He opened the file. Eleanor Hollins was descended through a female line connected to the Ashford family by a private marriage settlement 2 generations earlier. It was not a line the family liked to discuss.
Such lines are often remembered only when useful and erased when expensive. Beatrice gripped the edge of the chair. Was she entitled to the estate? Not simply she. The matter is more precise than that. He saw the confusion in her face and softened the explanation. Ashford Estate was bound by a settlement. Under certain conditions, control of the house and land could pass through the Hollins-Ashford line if the direct branch failed to satisfy terms laid down in the deed. Your mother's existence mattered. Your existence may matter more. Beatrice heard May as if it were a church bell rung miles away. May? Mr. Vale nodded. There is one document that decides it, a deed with a red wax seal. The public copies refer to it. The private ledgers depend upon it. But without the original,
Lord Ashford will deny everything until every witness is dead. Where is it? Mr. Vale's face tightened. That is the question men have spent years hoping no one would ask. He turned another page and showed her a line of text, written in a hand older than both of them. Red sealed deed lodged under private custody until claim by surviving female issue. Beatrice stared at the words until they blurred. Surviving female issue. For 26 years she had been called orphan, maid, girl, servant, Hollins blood with no Hollins family. Now the law, cold and distant as it was, had found a phrase large enough to contain her. If this deed exists, she asked, what happens? Mr. Vale folded his hands. If it exists, if it is authentic, and if you are proven to be Eleanor Hollins's daughter, then Lord Ashford's control of Ashford House and the estate income is vulnerable. Vulnerable, she repeated. The word sounded too small. Men like Lord Ashford prefer small words when discussing large thefts, Mr. Vale said. It was the first bitter thing he had allowed himself to say. Then he leaned back. You must understand, Miss Hollins, this will not be a fairy tale. A document does not leap from a drawer and crown a woman before breakfast. There will be resistance, delay, threats. Your character will be attacked before his claim is questioned. You will be called liar, thief, hysteric, opportunist, servant with ambitions above her station. Beatrice thought of the dining room, the laughter, the wine jug in her hand. I have already heard the simpler version. Mr. Vale looked at her, and for the first time, not as a maid who had entered the wrong office. Then perhaps you are better prepared than most. The year that followed did not transform Beatrice Hollins into a different woman. It revealed the woman Ashford House had failed to see. She did not suddenly become rich. She did not sweep through London in silk, or command carriages, or dine with judges. She rented a narrow room above a widow's shop, mended cuffs for money, copied legal documents when Mr. Vale trusted her hand enough, and spent every spare hour learning the exact shape of the law that had been used to bury her. Mr. Vale did not become warm, but he became steady. He taught her how to read a deed not like a story, but like a trap. Every word is placed because someone paid for it to be there, he told her. Ask who benefits from the sentence. Ask who disappears inside it. Beatrice asked. She asked until the answers formed a chain. Her mother's baptismal record, a private letter from the late Earl, a midwife's statement, a payment to keep Eleanor Hollins in Ashford House after her claim became inconvenient, a death notice written too vaguely, a copy of the settlement, damaged but readable. Each piece alone was fragile. Together, they became weight. Earl Ashford learned of the inquiry by spring. His first response was mockery, delivered through a solicitor's letter that referred to Beatrice as a former domestic servant attempting improper advancement. His second response was threat. A man followed her from Chancery Lane to the widow's shop. A clerk who had promised Mr. Vale access to an old archive suddenly withdrew permission. A letter arrived with no signature, advising Beatrice to return to service before she ruined herself. She kept it, dated it, and filed it with the rest. Fear did not leave her. It visited often. It sat on the edge of her narrow bed at night and asked what a woman like her could do against a man whose name opened doors before he knocked. But each time fear spoke, Beatrice unfolded the scrap she had carried from Ashford House and read the phrases again. Female issue. Red seal retained. Matter unresolved. Somewhere in London, in a box or vault or forgotten bundle, there was a document that knew her place even if no person had dared to say it aloud. In late autumn, Mr. Vale found the trail through an old Mercer archive. The firm had dissolved, its records divided between successors, creditors, and storage rooms no one wished to pay for. For 2 weeks, he and Beatrice searched through dust-heavy boxes beneath a clerk's office near Lincoln's Inn. They found leases, wills, marriage settlements, dead disputes over hedges and drainage rights, but not the deed. On the 15th day, when Beatrice's hands were gray with dust and her hope had gone quiet from exhaustion, she opened a long tin case marked only with the Ashford crest and a storage number matching one of the ledger entries from the library. Inside was a wrapped packet tied with blue ribbon. Beneath the ribbon was red wax, darkened with age, but unbroken. The seal showed a stag beneath the crown. Beatrice did not touch it at first. Mr. Vale came to stand beside her. For once he did not speak like a solicitor. He whispered, "Dear God." Beatrice looked at the seal, and in that moment she did not think of land, or title, or revenge. She thought of Eleanor Hollins, a mother reduced to a whisper, a woman who had known enough to be afraid, a name sliced from an index but not from the law. "Is it real?" Beatrice asked. Mr. Vale's eyes remained fixed on the red wax. "If the contents match the references," he said, "then yes." "And if it is real?" He turned to her then, and the room around them seemed to hold its breath. "Then Lord Ashford has been living in your house."
1 year after Earl Ashford told Beatrice Hollins to know her place, Ashford House prepared itself for another dinner. The servants rose before dawn, as they always had, and the house began its old performance of power. Fires built in every public room, silver polished until it reflected candlelight like water, carpets beaten, crystal inspected, flowers arranged in tall vases beneath portraits of men who had never carried anything heavier than their own importance. The dining room looked almost exactly as it had on the night Beatrice left it. The same long mahogany table stretched beneath the chandelier. The same carved crest stared down from above the fireplace. The same servant bells hung in the corridor beyond the door, each one waiting to tremble at the pull of a noble hand. But something in the house had changed before anyone could name it. Mrs. Finch felt it first. Old houses had moods if one had served them long enough, and that morning Ashford House seemed to hold its breath. The present Earl had been restless for weeks. Letters had arrived from London, bearing seals he broke in private and burned immediately after reading. 2 clerks had visited and left pale. A steward had been summoned, dismissed, summoned again, and heard raising his voice in the library before remembering that no employee of Ashford House was permitted to sound afraid. Still, the Earl had chosen to host dinner. Pride often mistakes a public room for armor. If he could sit beneath the family crest, surrounded by witnesses, speaking loudly of order and inheritance, perhaps the world would remember which man it had obeyed all these years. By 7 o'clock, carriages began arriving. Noblemen stepped down in polished shoes. Ladies lifted silk hems above the gravel. Laughter gathered in the entrance hall and floated upward, light and careless, as though nothing beneath that roof had ever been stolen from anyone without a surname long enough to defend it.
Earl Ashford greeted them with his usual practiced ease. His smile was a little tighter, his eyes a little sharper, but his guests were willing to mistake strain for dignity. They had done so with worse men. Lady Marwick was there again, wearing emeralds at her throat and a feathered headpiece that trembled when she laughed. Sir Edmund Valeham came with his wife. Lord Pemberton, who owed Ashford money, complimented the estate twice before removing his gloves. The room filled until it carried the same number as before, or close enough for memory to finish the count. 40 nobles beneath the candlelight, 40 witnesses prepared to be entertained by rank. Earl Ashford wanted them seated before he spoke of the rumors. He had already decided how to frame them. A former maid, he would say. A disturbed young woman, regrettably educated beyond her station. A solicitor seeking relevance in old age. A misunderstanding of obsolete papers. A servant's fantasy inflated by greedy men. He had rehearsed the phrases because phrases had rescued aristocrats for centuries. He believed that if he named Beatrice small enough, the room would help him make her small again. The first chorus had not yet been served when the butler entered the dining room with a face so controlled that only Mrs. Finch, standing near the far wall, understood he was shaken. He crossed to the Earl and bent low. "My lord," he murmured, "there is a lady at the door." Earl Ashford did not look up from adjusting the cuff at his wrist. "Then receive her in the drawing-room." "She asks to be received here." A few nearby guests heard and turned, grateful for interruption. Earl Ashford's expression hardened. "Name?" The butler hesitated. That hesitation traveled through the room more swiftly than an announcement. "Miss Beatrice Hollins." A fork touched porcelain with a tiny sound. Lady Marwick's head lifted. Mrs. Finch closed one hand around the edge of her apron. For a moment, Earl Ashford did not move. Then he smiled. It was an ugly smile, not because it lacked polish, but because it had too much. "How theatrical," he said. "It seems our former maid has developed a taste for entrances." Laughter rose, but thinly. The guests did not yet know whether they were permitted amusement or should prepare concern. Earl Ashford leaned back in his chair. "Let her in." The doors opened. Beatrice Hollins entered Ashford's dining room without a tray, without an apron, and without lowering her eyes. She wore a dark blue dress cut with restraint rather than vanity, gloves buttoned neatly at the wrist, and a bonnet simple enough to avoid spectacle, but fine enough that no one could mistake her for a servant sent upstairs by accident. In her hands she carried a flat leather document case. Behind her came Mr. Nathaniel Vale, white-haired, solemn, and dressed in black, with the expression of a man who had spent his life watching ink destroy lies. 2 younger clerks followed, each carrying papers tied in ribbon. Beatrice did not sweep into the room like a heroine in a cheap novel. She walked steadily. That was worse. Every servant watching understood at once that she had not come to beg. Every noble watching understood it a moment later and disliked the feeling.
Earl Ashford rose slowly. "Miss Hollins," he said, drawing her name out with amused contempt. "How generous of you to visit the room where you were last employed." Beatrice stopped several feet from the table. The chandelier shone above her. On the wall behind the Earl, the old Ashford crest seemed suddenly less like a symbol and more like evidence. "Good evening, Lord Ashford." Her voice was calm. That calm disturbed him more than any accusation could have. "Have you come to apologize for the inconvenience your little inquiry has caused?" he asked. "I have come to conclude it." Lady Marwick's feathers trembled again, but this time not with laughter. Earl Ashford glanced toward Mr. Vale. "And you have brought an audience of clerks to my dinner?" "No," Beatrice said. "I brought a solicitor to your witnesses."
The room went very still.
Earl Ashford's eyes narrowed. "You forget yourself." The sentence might once have bent her shoulders. It did not now. Beatrice looked at him, and for the first time he seemed to realize that the silence he remembered in her had never been emptiness. It had been storage. "I was told that once before," she said. "In this room." A few guests shifted in their chairs. Some remembered, others pretended not to. The cruelty of the year before had been light entertainment then, one more anecdote to carry into drawing rooms and forget by breakfast. But shame has a different weight when it returns carrying documents. Earl Ashford laughed sharply. "If you imagine that dressing above your rank grants you one, you are even more foolish than I thought." Beatrice did not answer him. She turned slightly toward Mr. Vale. "Please read the preliminary statement." Mr. Vale opened his file. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but the trained precision in it reached every corner of the dining room.
"I am Nathaniel Vale, formerly of Vale and Mercer, Chancery Lane, solicitor in matters pertaining to private family settlements and estate conveyance. I appear tonight in relation to the Ashford Hollins settlement, executed under seal and preserved in original form." Earl Ashford struck the table with his palm. "This is absurd!" Mr. Vale did not look up. "The original deed has been authenticated by seal, signature, witness notation, archival custody, and corresponding entries in the Ashford Estate ledger. Those records are private." "They are material," Mr. Vale replied. "And now contested." Lord Pemberton leaned toward the man beside him and whispered something that died before becoming a sentence. Beatrice opened the leather case. The red-sealed deed lay inside, wrapped in protective cloth. Even before Mr. Vale lifted it, the color of the wax drew every eye in the room. It was dark red, almost brown with age, impressed with the Ashford stag beneath its crown. Beatrice remembered seeing that crest carved in wood, stitched on carriage cloth, pressed into silver, painted above the fireplace, engraved on rings worn by men who thought symbols obeyed only them. Now the same crest sat in wax on a document held by the woman they had once laughed at. Mr. Vale placed the deed on a small writing table the butler had brought with trembling hands. "The deed provides that under conditions specified in the settlement, control of Ashford House, its principal revenues, and the attached 280 acres pass through the Hollins-Ashford female line upon claim by surviving lawful issue." His hand moved to another page. "Eleanor Hollins, deceased, was a lawful descendant of that line. Beatrice Hollins, present, has been proven by parish record, witness statement, private correspondence, and maintained household account to be her surviving daughter." Lady Marwick's lips parted. The Earl's face had lost its smile.
"No," he said, not loudly. "Not yet. You cannot read a house out from under a man at dinner." Mr. Vale looked at him then. "No, my lord. The deed did that years ago. Dinner merely supplies witnesses." For several seconds, no one spoke. The fire cracked in the grate. Somewhere beyond the dining room, one of the servant bells gave a faint tremor, perhaps from a draught, perhaps from a hand in another room unaware that commands were becoming dangerous things. Earl Ashford looked from Mr. Vale to the deed, then to Beatrice, as if one of them might reveal the trick. "She was a maid," he said. The words came out flat, stripped of wit. "She carried wine in this room." Mr. Vale folded the paper in his hand. "The law does not ask whether the rightful claimant has carried wine." A murmur moved through the table. There it was, the first crack in the room's obedience. Not compassion, not justice, not sudden moral awakening. Recognition. The nobles understood documents. They understood seals. They understood the terror of property moving by a sentence no one had bothered to read carefully enough. Beatrice watched their faces change as they translated her from servant into threat. She did not enjoy it as much as she had once imagined she might. Perhaps because the girl who had imagined revenge had done so with a wine jug shaking in her hand. The woman standing there now had spent a year learning that victory was not fire. It was weight. Earl Ashford tried to gather himself. "Even if such a paper exists, possession does not make her fit to control Ashford Estate. She has no training in management, no social standing. No, she has 8 years of estate ledgers committed to memory," Mr. Vale said, "and 1 year of formal preparation. Your own steward's accounts, my lord, proved more useful to her than to you." A few eyes turned toward the steward, who had gone gray near the wall. Beatrice finally spoke. "You taught me more than you intended." Earl Ashford looked at her with open hatred now. It suited him better than charm. "I taught you charity." "No," Beatrice said. "You taught me what power sounds like when it believes no one beneath it is listening." He took a step toward her. A clerk moved, but Beatrice lifted one hand slightly, stopping him. She had not come all this way to be protected from a man already defeated by paper. "You think a seal can make you Ashford," the Earl said. "You think a scrap of wax can make this house yours." Beatrice looked around the dining room, the fireplace, the crest, the long table, the servants at the walls, Mrs. Finch with tears she refused to let fall, the nobles who had once laughed because laughter was easier than courage. Then she looked back at him. "No. The wax only proves what your family tried to hide." His jaw tightened. "You know nothing of this name." "I know what it cost my mother." That struck differently. The room heard it. So did he. "Do not speak of matters you cannot understand," he said. Beatrice's voice remained low. "My mother entered this house with a claim. She died in it as a whisper. I entered it as an orphan. You kept me here as a servant." "You let me dust the shelves that held the records of my own blood. You let me polish the silver bought with land that was not securely yours. Then, in front of this room, you told me to know my place." She paused, not for drama, but because the words deserved space after a year of silence. "I did, my lord. I found it written in red wax." No one laughed. That was the moment Earl Ashford truly lost the room. Legal defeat could be delayed by petitions, objections, and expensive men with careful handwriting. Social defeat happened faster. It moved from face to face, from silence to posture, from posture to retreat. Lord Pemberton looked down first. Lady Marwick closed her fan. Sir Edmund Valeham slowly removed his hand from the wine-glass, as though afraid the table itself had become evidence. Earl Ashford understood then what all arrogant men understand too late. Power depends not only on what one owns, but on what others agree to pretend. The room had stopped pretending. "I will contest this," he said. "You may," Mr. Vale replied. "The courts are open to men with money and insufficient humility." It was the closest thing to cruelty Beatrice had ever heard from him. "Until final administrative transfer," he continued, "Lord Ashford is restrained from disposing of estate assets, dismissing key household staff without review, removing documents, or obstructing inspection. Formal notice has been delivered to the steward, the bank, and the relevant estate officers." The Earl turned toward his steward. "You knew?" The steward looked as if he might faint. "My lord, the papers arrived this afternoon. I was advised—" "Advised by whom?" "By the law," Beatrice said. The simplicity of it enraged him. He looked back at her, and for one instant the mask slipped far enough to show not nobility, not authority, but panic. "What do you want?" he asked. There it was, the question no servant was ever supposed to hear from a master. Beatrice could have answered with everything: the house, the land, the income, the name, the apology, the years. Her mother's grave dressed with truth instead of pity, the dining room on its knees. But revenge, if made too hungry, becomes another master. She thought of Mrs. Finch's warning: "Do not let revenge make you their mirror." "Tonight," Beatrice said, "I want you to leave this room without insulting anyone who serves in it." A faint shock passed through the servants along the wall. Earl Ashford stared. "You dare command me in my own house?" Beatrice rested her gloved hand beside the deed. "That is the matter being corrected." The room seemed to inhale.
He did not leave at once.
Men like Earl Ashford require several seconds to understand that refusal has become performance, and performance can worsen defeat. He looked to the guests, but no ally rose. He looked to Lady Marwick, but she studied the tablecloth with sudden fascination. He looked to Lord Pemberton, who had discovered great interest in his cuff. Finally, the Earl stepped back. His face had settled into a pale, controlled fury that promised future battles. But the dining room did not belong to fury anymore. It belonged to fact. He walked toward the door. When he passed Beatrice, he stopped close enough that only she could hear his breath. "You will never be one of us," he said. Beatrice looked at him without hatred. That too was a victory. "I pray not." He left the room. The door did not slam. Servants' doors slammed. Angry men of rank preferred quieter exits when witnesses mattered. For a moment after he was gone, no one moved. Then Mrs. Finch did something no one expected. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, in full view of the guests, and gave Beatrice the formal curtsy once reserved for ladies of the house. It was not deep enough to be theatrical, not shallow enough to be mistaken. It was exact. Beatrice's eyes burned, but she held herself still. Other servants followed, not all at once, not like a staged rebellion, but one by one: the butler, the footman, the young maid who had once told her not to think on gentlemen's cruelty. The nobles watched, understanding that the house had recognized its mistress before society had decided what to call her. Mr. Vale cleared his throat softly. "Miss Hollins, there are immediate matters of household instruction." Beatrice turned toward the servant bells on the wall beyond the open dining room door. Each label seemed sharper now. Dining room, library, blue chamber, master's study. For years, those bells had told invisible hands where to run. She looked at the butler. "No servant is to be dismissed for anything connected to this matter. All unpaid wages or withheld wages are to be reviewed by morning. Any tenant petitions delayed under Lord Ashford's instruction are to be brought to the library tomorrow." The butler bowed. "Yes, Miss Hollins." She paused at the title. Not lady, not mistress, not owner. Just her name, spoken without contempt in a room that had once swallowed it. For tonight, that was enough. Then she added, "And have the dining room bell removed from the servants' corridor?" A small sound moved through the servants, barely audible, too disciplined to be a gasp, too emotional to be silence. Beatrice looked once more at the long table. The guests had come expecting dinner. They had received a lesson in documents. "The meal may continue," she said, "if anyone still has appetite."
Later, when the guests had departed with their gossip folded carefully behind polite expressions, and Earl Ashford had locked himself in a room that no longer promised safety, Beatrice went alone to the library. She did not need to steal a candle now. Lamps had been lit openly. The fire burned for her because she had ordered it so, though the thought still felt strange in her chest. The library looked both familiar and impossible. There was the shelf where she had first touched a legal book with the back of her finger. There was the table where gentlemen had once left rings of brandy on estate maps. There was the cabinet whose lock had opened the first true door of her life. Mr. Vale had placed the red-sealed deed on the desk beneath a weighted glass. In the lamplight, the wax seemed almost alive. Beatrice stood before it for a long time. She expected triumph to feel louder. Instead, what came was grief. Grief for her mother, who had known enough to be afraid and not enough to be safe.
Grief for the girl who had slept beneath this roof without knowing the house had been using her ignorance as mortar. Grief for every servant who had mistaken endurance for destiny because no one had ever shown them the document that named the theft. Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway, but did not enter until Beatrice nodded. The old housekeeper walked slowly to the desk. Her eyes fell on the deed, then on Beatrice. "Eleanor would have wanted to see this." Beatrice touched the edge of the glass, not the wax. "Did she ever speak of it?" "Only once," Mrs. Finch said. "She said paper could be more dangerous than knives because gentlemen invited paper into every room." Beatrice gave a small, sad smile. "She was right." Mrs. Finch's hands trembled. "I should have done more." Beatrice turned to her. "You kept the key?" "A key is not a rescue." "No," Beatrice said gently. "But it was not nothing." The old woman looked away, and for the first time since Beatrice had known her, Mrs. Finch seemed not old, but tired from carrying the dead. Beatrice reached for her hand. "Tomorrow there will be solicitors, objections, inventories, tenants, banks, and more men telling me what is proper." "Yes," Mrs. Finch said, "there will." "Tonight," Beatrice said, "I only want my mother's full name written somewhere no one can cut it out." Mrs. Finch nodded. Together they opened a blank page in the family record book. Beatrice dipped the pen, held it steady, and wrote, Eleanor Hollins, mother of Beatrice Hollins, lawful daughter of the Ashford Hollins line. Her hand did not shake until the final letter. Then she closed the book, not to hide the name, but to preserve it.
By morning, Ashford House no longer sounded the same. It did not become gentle in a single night. Houses built on hierarchy do not transform merely because a deed changes hands. But the first command of the new day was not a bell. It was Beatrice walking through the servants' corridor and stopping before the empty place where the dining room bell had hung. The wall behind it was paler than the surrounding wood, a small ghost of old obedience. A young maid stared at the mark as if expecting the bell to reappear by force of habit. Beatrice stood beside her. "What is your name?" she asked. The girl startled. "Clara, miss." "Can you read, Clara?" The girl lowered her eyes. "A little, miss." Beatrice looked toward the library stairs. "Then you will read better." The girl looked up, confused. Beatrice did not explain further because some promises should first be made in action. She had learned that from paper. Later that week, notices went out to tenants whose petitions had been ignored. Wages were reviewed. The steward discovered that Beatrice's memory of the ledgers was not ornamental. Earl Ashford remained in temporary residence under legal restriction, a guest of procedure in the house he had mistaken for his birthright. He avoided the dining room. He avoided the library. Most of all, he avoided Beatrice, because every meeting forced him to stand before the living correction of his favorite sentence. The court battles would continue. Men with money rarely surrendered at the first defeat, but the essential thing had already happened. The room had gone silent. The deed had been read. The house had heard. One afternoon, Beatrice stood at the front steps of Ashford House and looked over the 280 acres rolling beyond the drive. Fields, tenant cottages, winter trees, stone walls, smoke rising from distant chimneys. For years, she had moved through that land as part of its machinery, unseen and unnamed. Now, every acre carried responsibility as heavy as inheritance. Mr. Vale stood beside her, holding his hat against the wind. "You understand," he said, "that possession is only the beginning." Beatrice watched a tenant child run along the lane with a stick in one hand and a crust of bread in the other. "Yes?" "There will be people who say you do not belong here." "They have been saying that all my life." "And what will you answer?" Beatrice thought of the dining room, the laughter, the Earl's voice, her mother's name, the red wax under glass. Then she turned back toward the house, not as a servant returning through the side entrance, but as a woman entering through the front door with the law behind her and memory before her. "Nothing at first," she said. "I have learned the value of letting paper speak." That evening, as sunset reddened the windows of Ashford House, the red-sealed deed rested in the library where Beatrice had once read in secret. It did not shout. It did not threaten. It did not need to. Earl Ashford had believed power lived in blood, rooms, titles, and the laughter of people seated above a servant. But blood can be hidden, rooms can change hands, titles can be hollowed out, and laughter can die in a single breath when truth enters carrying a seal. Beatrice Hollins did not win because she became crueler than the man who humiliated her. She won because she survived long enough to read what he never thought she would understand.
The aristocracy did not bleed when scratched by swords. It bled when scratched by paper.